Hello. For this video, I'm going to be talking to you about Aristophanes' play Peace. So this, as you might guess from the name, is one of Aristophanes' anti-war plays, along with plays like Lysistrata and Acharnians, both of which I've done videos on before. It's an interesting play, in part because they're not necessarily that much plot. The play centers on this character, Tigerius, who rides a giant flying dung beetle from Earth up to heaven, up to Mount Olympus, to try and see the gods, specifically to see Zeus. And basically he wants to know why there's so much war in Hellas, why there's so much war in Greece. Aristophanes, remember, was writing during the time of the Peloponnesian War. Athens was not doing fantastically well in the war against Sparta, but this was a lengthy war, and so Aristophanes, when he writes these anti-war plays, he is responding to the real conditions that his city-state finds itself in. So Tigerius goes up to Olympus, and he asks basically what's happened, and the god Hermes, who's the only one of the Olympians there, basically tells him that the gods had regularly wanted peace, and human beings, the Greeks, I mean the Greeks are kind of the only people who count in this equation, but the Hellenes had continually chosen war. So the Olympians abandoned Olympus. They went, Hermes says here, they were so vexed with Hellas. Therefore here where they were dwelling, they've established war and given you up entirely to his will, but they themselves have settled up aloft as high as they can go, that they no more may see your fighting or receive your prayers. So the Olympians have basically left the running of things to war and his sidekick, Riot. So war has buried peace under the ground in Olympus, and Tigerius calls the chorus of farmers to dig peace up so that he can end the fighting on Earth and restore peace, restore order, and particularly restore the farming cycle, because that's one of the things that's really central in this play, much more so than a lot of Aristophanes' other plays. This is a pastoral play. There's a lot of speeches here that seem entirely, their entire purpose is to glorify farming, to glorify gathering crops, harvest festivals, making and drinking wine, having feasts of delicious rustic fare, and all this. And all of that can only occur in the context of peace. So that's ultimately sort of the goal here, is peace needs to be reestablished, the war needs to be ended, so that the Hellenes can go back to this lovely rustic lifestyle where they gather crops, feast, etc., etc. And we see this throughout. Now, I want to read you just one of the speeches where we get this sort of pastoral, and this is an interaction between Tigerius and the chorus. Tigerius starts out, he says, "Think of all the thousand pleasures, comrades, which to peace we owe, all the life of ease and comfort which she gave us long ago, figs and olives, wine and myrtles, luscious fruit preserved and dried, banks of fragrant violets blowing by the crystal fountain's side, scenes for which our hearts are yearning, joys that we have missed so long. Comrades, there is peace returning, greet her back with dance and song. This is after they've dug up peace, by the way. And then the chorus says, welcome, welcome, best and dearest, welcome, welcome, welcome home. We have looked and longed for thee, looking, longing wondrously, once again our farms to see. Oh, the joy, the bliss, the rapture, really to behold thee come. Thou wast I our favorite enjoyment, thou wast I our greatest gain. So, in the first part where we have Trygaeus giving this sort of speech, we've got this list of agricultural products. Figs and olives, wine and myrtles, luscious fruits, violets, etc., etc. And so we've got all of that stuff tied to peace. Again, peace has just been dug up here by the chorus of farmers, and she gives her two handmaids to Trygaeus to take back to Earth. One, if I can find her name real quickly. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it. But one, he gives to, or one she, Peace, via Hermes, because Peace never speaks. One handmaid she gives to Trygaeus specifically to become his wife. If I look long enough, I will find it. But I'm going to stop now. So one handmaid she gives to Trygaeus specifically to become his wife, and this is actually, in a way, a fairly conventional comedy ending, in the sense of like Shakespearean comedies, these sort of later comedies, things like this, much more so than Aristophanes, because the play actually does end with a wedding, with a celebration and things like that. The other handmaid she gives to the council, the Athenian council, to sort of remind them to maintain peace. And so that's sort of what happens in the play, is basically Trygaeus goes to Olympus riding on a flying dung beetle, digs up peace, brings her handmaids back, and everything is good. Bountiful, pastoral, rustic, etc., etc. There's a couple of other sort of small things I do want to touch on here. If you've watched some of my other videos on Aristophanes' plays, particularly I think Knights and Wasps, one of the things Aristophanes periodically does is has a long-ish choral interlude where basically they just say, Aristophanes is the greatest, you should give him the prize, etc., etc. All the other comic playwrights suck, their humor is cheap, they recycle jokes, etc., etc. I'm not going to rehash the whole thing. I'll put links up in the corner to those videos, but I just want to mention this briefly. Part of the irony of Aristophanes continually using this technique where he knocks other playwrights for using the same material over and over and over, it's kind of ironic that he is here using this same dramatic gesture over and over and over in a series of plays. He says essentially the same thing in one of his critiques of the other playwrights that he keeps repeating, is that they use the same material over and over and over again. So that's one of the other things that I find striking about this play. The other is a reference during the ceremonies honoring peace before the feasting, the wedding at the end of the play. Trygaeus says to one of the servants, "Now throw the corn among the audience." And the servant does, and says, "There." Trygaeus says, "What, thrown it out already?" And the servant says, "Yes, by Hermes. There's not a single man among them all but has at least one corn, I'll warrant you." Trygaeus says, "Aye, but the women." And the servant says, "If they haven't got one, they'll get it by and by," which I assume is a dirty joke, a sort of reference to pregnancy, sort of bun in the oven type metaphor. But the reason that's interesting to me is that among classicists and among people who work specifically on the conditions under which Greek tragedy and comedy were performed, there's a lot of debate about whether or not women attended the plays, whether or not they attended specifically the city Dionysia and the Lenaea, which were the two sort of main Athenian festivals where drama was presented. And so here we have a reference in one of the plays saying, "I but the women" of the audience. So my personal opinion on the issue is that there probably were women in attendance. They probably made up a minority of the audience. So most people, I think, accept that, at the very least, important priestesses and things like this attended. But a lot of priestesses were virgins. They were consecrated, like the cult of Hestia, for instance. In English, we're more familiar with the term Vestal Virgin, which is the Roman version, Vesta, as opposed to the Greek version, Hestia. But the cult of Hestia, the women were virgins. A lot of the priestesses were holy virgins. Not all of them necessarily, but it seems like a joke that wouldn't, to me at least, if I'm sort of reading this right, if the only women in the audience are holy virgins, it seems like a joke that's not going to land all that well to say, well, they'll soon be pregnant, because that doesn't make that much sense. Whereas if we assume that there are other women, citizens' wives, maybe medics' wives, whatever it is, maybe young girls, unmarried young girls, whatever it is, if we assume that they're in the audience, in the patriarchal society of ancient Athens, this joke makes a lot more sense. This sort of suggestion that, well, soon the women should all be pregnant. I mean, it's not funny to us today, but there's at least a logic to it, whereas if the only women attending this performance are consecrate virgins who are not going to be pregnant anytime soon, the joke doesn't make that much sense. So it's not sort of concrete evidence, and the argument is going to go on and on and on about whether or not women attended the theater in ancient Greece. My personal opinion is they probably did, probably not in substantial numbers. I mean, we're not talking 50% of the audience here, but I suspect some of them did. But there's no definite answer right now. But I think Aristophanes points us in that direction.